in Bengali, all of this is translated into English, and the English is incomprehensible. One line is, "Under the stamp of Azur's feet, there are no parijat flowers in the Nandan gardens," end quote. I mean, you know, this is just perfect nonsense to anyone today, but the comment on it by the judge who sentenced the author was sedition. That is sedition. There was one example of a line in the poem in which the prosecution said, the meaning of the line was, "Arise, Indians, throw out the British." And the defense attorney said, no, if you look at the Sanskrit roots, it says, "Go into business, get rich." And so you have these wonderful examples of disputes over the meaning of things, of reading. And it always ended with the authors and the publishers going to prison. Well, I don't have time to go into more of this, but I think that if you look at the way censorship actually operated in 3 authoritarian systems, you can ask questions about censorship in general. Far from being the same thing everywhere and at all times, it has, of course, varied according to the character of each regime. It should be studied, I believe, ethnographically as an ingredient in a political culture and not as the villain of a story that always has the same plot, repression versus liberty. That did occur. But what's important, I think, is to seize the differences and to understand the way censorship was an element that involved literature itself at every stage. So, in each of these cases, you can see how political cultures crystallized around core principles: privilege, surveillance, planning. In each case, power pervaded every aspect of literary life, constituting literature itself as a cultural system within the socio-political order. Censorship took place everywhere at the level of everyday life. It was commensurate, if you like, with literature. It was part of literature, and I don't think you can understand literature without understanding censorship. Now, I'm now in the face of a paradox, however. When anthropologists go into the bush, as they call it, go into so-called primitive areas and try to understand how other people's mental universes operate, they interview the natives, and they're often shocked. Of course, they want to be objective as anthropologists, but when it's a matter of, well, not just wearing veils for women, but actually harming women's sexual apparatus and so on, the anthropologist is shocked. And so the experience of the anthropologist is often to try to be objective and to give an honest account of how a different cultural system operates. And yet at the same time, the anthropologist feels his or her own values being challenged and becomes even hypersensitive about his or her own values. Now, this happened to me as a historian anthropologist studying the archives of censors. Why? Because I too believe in freedom of speech. I make my confession to you, Marina. In fact, as a U.S. citizen, I believe in the First Amendment to the American Constitution, which guarantees freedom of the press. So here I am studying systems in which freedom of the press is abused. And I'm trying to be neutral, anthropological, or ethnographic. And so, of course, what happens in this kind of work is that I think you owe it to your public to be frank about your point of view. Now, this may sound easy, but it's not. And part of the problem is postmodernism. Now, I have lots of sympathies with lots of parts of aspects of postmodernism. I've quoted Foucault, and I could quote other people. But one tendency in postmodernism is to say censorship is just a form of constraint. And constraints exist everywhere. Every word we say is filtered through some kind of apparatus. And if you're a Freudian, of course, the filter, and Freud uses the word censor in the head, the filter is censoring every word you say. If you're a Marxist, the marketplace is filtering. But there is also a kind of literary criticism which sees censorship, which sees constraints in every use of every word, Derrida, etc. So we all live in a world of constraints. And when I discuss this with my students, I often say, could you give me examples of censorship in the sense of constraints? You know, not just burning books, but constraints. And the examples they give include things like wearing a necktie, or not wearing a necktie, stopping at a red light, or refusing to stop at a red light. And they said, calling a professor, professor. I don't know if you do this here at UNAM, but my point is that constraints are everywhere, everywhere. They penetrate all social interaction. And there are some postmodern critics who say that's what censorship is. And the First Amendment to the US Constitution is just another fiction. I disagree. And that's where the battle is joined. Because it seems to me that you trivialize the concept of censorship if you identify it with constraints of all kinds. And therefore, although I don't have a definition, I would say that censorship involves the power of the state, or sometimes the church in some systems. But it should not be confused with constraints of all kinds, including what Thomas does when he accepts or rejects a book. Now, I understand the other argument, but this is where my position is. So, despite the scorn of literary critics for what they call First Amendment pieties within the U.S., I myself subscribe to the principle of freedom of speech as it's guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution, even though I recognize the culture-bound character of that commitment, because, of course, the U.S. Constitution doesn't apply outside the boundaries of the U.S. But you have people, surely, in Mexico who believe in freedom of the speech. There are constitutions and treaties and agreements in many countries, and I think the principle of freedom of the speech exists more or less everywhere. It should not be trivialized. So this principle can be found in other political cultures, along with the same tension between relativism and commitment that I've tried to describe. So I would end by saying that we need to understand censorship, not merely to condemn it. But while making an attempt at understanding, we must also take a stand, especially today, when the state, with help from Google and Facebook, is watching every move we make.